Welcome back. We're in our text in Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 30 this time. We still have Jesus here demonstrating how to catch men. Looked at the points of an apprentice last week and how Jesus demonstrated what it means to one that's going to follow him and catch men. Has he caught you? That's a good question to start with. Is it real to you, or is it religion for you, the subject of Jesus and the Bible and church? We left off where Jesus has called a publican, Matthew. First name Levi changed to Matthew. He was given grace, unmerited favor, getting something you don't deserve and cannot possibly earn on your own. Matthew returned the grace given to him and invited Jesus over to his house. This is where our story makes a significant turn of opposites and contrasts. From what we saw last week, Jesus, 1, demonstrated mercy and compassion. 2, humility and timing. 3, forgiveness and restoration. And 4, he demonstrated inclusion and acceptance when it came to this guy, Matthew, a publican. This week, we will compare and contrast everything Jesus demonstrated here that we just saw in the last text against those who claim to be a follower of God, but don't really. And that's verses 30 through 39, where it starts off with, "But their scribes and Pharisees murmured against the disciples, saying, 'Why do ye eat and drink with publicans and sinners?' And Jesus answering said unto them, 'They that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance.' And they said unto him, 'Why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, and likewise the disciples of the Pharisees? But thine eat and drink.' And he said unto them, 'Can ye make the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then shall they fast in those days.' And he spake also a parable unto them, saying, No man putteth a piece of new garment upon an old, if otherwise then both the new maketh a rent, and the piece that was taken out of the new agreeth not with the old. And no man putteth a new wine into old bottles, else the new wine will burst the bottles and be spilled, and the bottles shall perish. But new wine be put into new bottles, and both are preserved. No man also having drunken old wine saith straightway, Desireth new, for he saith, The old is better." So what we're going to do is take just the pieces of that text and kind of expose it today, more like a lesson. Notice the first word in verse 30 is but. We see the indication of a comparison, a contrast here. This, but that. The Roman Senate delegated the taxation in those days to rich capitalists who agreed to pay a certain sum into the treasury, then reimburse themselves with taxes they collected. There were several classes of these tax collectors. The first one, top one, is the magister, the chairman of the publicani, a Roman group. The magister could be called the Don of the Roman mob. The publicani, well, that's the Roman mob. They formed a joint stock company, also known as the Roman Knights, an ancient order of middle rank members of society between senators and the people. They were the enforcers in society. If taxation and money wasn't enough to rule with, they also ran most of their illegal operations, like syndicates, human trafficking, smuggling of provincial goods, prostitution, laundering, extortion of provincial leaders, like in this case, Herod and Pilate in Jesus' time. Then you had the sub-magistracy that worked for the publicani, made returns to the magister in Rome, and supervised the praetores, or the publicans, as we're seeing here in Matthew. Zacchaeus was a sub-magister, or a chief of publicans. We'll meet him later in Luke 19 and verse 2. And then we finally have the praetores, or the publicans, as we read here in our scripture. They physically collected the taxes and ran the syndicate works for the publicani, or the mob. Matthew was a praetore, a publican. He was a tax gatherer and a syndicate member. Although the publicans on all levels were hated in masses, these were especially detested. They were the boots on the ground for the syndicate, the face of their pain. In this case, a Jew, Matthew, was taking taxes from his own people and then laundering against them for their occupied Roman occupiers. There's a problem. Jews would not associate with them in the temple or synagogue. They were not permitted to give testimony in the Jewish courts. Their gifts brought to the temple were rejected by the priests. They were cut out They were completely excluded from their Jewish friends and family. They were outcast. They were regarded by other Jews as no better than a heathen, Matthew 18:17 says. They were classified as sinners, later here in Luke 7 and verse 34. They were mentioned with harlots, Matthew 21:31. They were viewed as the lowest position in morals and the vilest of the vile, like Matthew 5 tells us. They would sit at the seat of receipt of custom, as we find in the book of Matthew, and also about this text when Luke was called. That literally means the toll house, contracting their business in a seated position in a small booth built by foot of bridges, gates of cities, mouths of rivers, lakes, seaports, anywhere people had to go to ensure the tax gathering. These guys were hated. Here we have a changed man, a changed name, and a changed life. He went from old to new, Levi to Matthew, tax gatherer and extortioner to a man of grace and mercy, old to new. He made an invitation to Christ. Verse 29, the text moves into what 29 says is a great feast in his own house. Because he was a portatorus or a publican, he had a lot of money. He had extorted a lot of people. He had made his way. And so he had a great house, so he had a great feast in his own house. He threw a party, a meal with guests in his own house in honor of Jesus and to introduce Jesus to his friends, as you see in the text. But who were his friends? Well, it says here in the pages, publicans and sinners. The worst of the worst. The undesirables, the outcasts. They were eating and drinking with publicans and sinners, it says literally. There weren't a few either. This was a big event in a big home. Luke said, great multitude of publicans and sinners in his own house. Great multitude means a lot. This is obviously God's heart, though, to invite others to meet Jesus and rejoice with you in your newfound faith. Matthew exposed his friends, the undesirables, to Jesus. Don't you think we ought to be doing the same thing? So many of my friends on Facebook are being kicked off Facebook and blocked because of political stuff. Wouldn't it be nice if we were persecuted for righteousness' sake instead of political sake? Expose our friends and undesirables to Jesus, make a link, make a connection. But more than that happened. You see, there's a difference in this reading and also what we catch in the book of Mark. Here in verse 29 it says, and Levi made him a great feast in his own house, and there was a great company of publicans and of others that sat with them. So Jesus and the disciples are sitting with them. With them. One, are we even willing to do that? Two, the book of Mark, chapter 2, verse 15, tells the same story and says it this way. For there were many, and they followed him. This with him ended up becoming, once this whole scene was over, that we're going to break out, that they ended up following him. They, the publicans, the sinners, the outcasts, the undesirables, the friends of friends, not only sat with Christ, but also followed him. This was an evangelistic dinner, an opportunity. This is why Jesus came to do this very thing, and Matthew hosted one of the first breakouts. Verse 30, but the Pharisees crashed the party. Here is the contrast then to the apprentice of Christ, what we just see Matthew doing, which is exactly everything that Jesus just got through doing. Now we're about to see the opposite. Number one, they are sick and they don't know it. Pharisees are always sick and don't know it. I'd like to let you know that Pharisees are alive and well even to this day, even in some of our churches. You see, they condemn Jesus for being with these kind of people. Do people still do that? They thought he should be with the more religious ones themselves. After all, if he really was a teacher sent from God, why is he hanging with the outcast? Consorting with the outcast on any level would have been a major problem. Merely speaking to them could have you banned from any kind of group. That's bad enough. But eating and drinking with them implied a level of friendship that was abhorrent to the Pharisees. And we're going to see a whole lot more of this all the way through the book of Luke. They finally find a way to have Jesus killed. The outcasts knew they were in need of a physician. They knew they weren't okay. They wanted inclusion and acceptance. The Pharisees did not. This is why Jesus used the analogy, those who think they are well don't need a doctor. Do you find that to be true also in religious circles? I think I do. Secondly, the Pharisees, they are emotionally in crisis almost all the time. They come into a party, a feast no less, at someone else's house and start complaining that people aren't fasting. That's crazy. They come to a party, a feast, at somebody else's house and start complaining that people aren't fasting. The Pharisees saw fasting as a public exercise to display their own spirituality. Jesus himself condemned this. He says, when you do it, it's to be done personally between you and God and not for men. Matthew chapter 6, 16 through 18. But it's also in Isaiah 58, where it comes to the fact that this should be a private thing. The fasting was all a smokescreen, though, folks. It was a smokescreen. They had a problem with the party, period. They just want to point out something to make a point. Some people just can't celebrate. Why? They're in an emotional crisis. Fasting is for sorrow and prayer in need of answer or deliverance from something. That's the basis of it, for part of worship. Jesus basically says, why would you do that when you're having a party with the groom at his wedding? Jesus using the analogy here. Jesus is the groom. We're the bride. Jesus is there. When he's there, there should be joy and rejoicing. And they couldn't see that because they didn't see him as anything special. But I tell you what, these publicans did. These sinners did. If Jesus is in you and you are in here, why would you not joy and rejoice? There's only one answer. You're having an emotional crisis. Well, what kind exactly? Well, look at the Pharisees. They had a problem with sinners and Jesus. And that got to them. They had a problem with this mingling of people like that. And it wore them up. They were better than. They were elitist. They were too cool, too old, too self-righteous, do that kind of sort of thing. But the Pharisees saw themselves as too good for others and too good for themselves. Even the Sadducees and the Pharisees couldn't even get along. Too stuck up to celebrate. Always the detail of everything and the criticism. So he gave the analogy of a bridegroom at the wedding celebration to kind of stump them, but he didn't quit there. He goes on and gives two parables. One, that they cannot adapt. They have an incapability of adapting because their critical spirit, their emotional crisis, and the nitpickiness about every little thing. So he gave these two parables about old and new. Just like Matthew went from old to new man, and now his friends, old to new. He's trying to show this as a parallel to them. The new, and the first one about cloth, is unshrunk cloth. Anyone who grew up in the days of unshrunk denim jeans, 100% cotton shirts and fabric, can easily explain this parable. They understand because they lived it. You patch an old shrunken garment with a new unwashed piece, and the patch will pull away in the wash and tear both. The thinner the fabric, the worse it gets. The law is what he's trying to parallel here. Is hard enough. But the Pharisees had added nearly 1,000 new amendments and additions to the written law of Moses. It's not even God. It's above and beyond it. This is a definition of legalism. It is not from God, but man. You're not blessed for doing it. You're burdened for doing it. It's just more legalism, a lack of grace. For the cloth analogy, it comes down to plugging in man's self-righteous ways, like a patch, onto God's truth. It will not last. People will get burnt, and it's not his way. Now the wine analogy. Jesus uses this and goes a little further than just the cloth. If you take freshly made wine and pour it into old worn wineskin bags, they use in those days, bottles, they will leak. The fermentation process causes the wine to expand naturally, and the bag is going to stretch until it bursts, and all is lost, like Jesus said. The old traditional skin of Judaism, this religion, was too brittle to hold the new wine of God's kingdom of grace that Jesus was offering. You can't plug in Jesus to your broken ways. That's what he's saying. You can't just patch this thing together, and you can't try to keep what you got and put something new in it. It won't work. It won't mix. You can't hold on to the old traditions of man, not God, but man, that seem religious and try to follow Jesus anew. It won't work. You can't have a system of grace in the old bag of tradition. It won't work. There will just be loss, as he said. And if you just let it be separate, at least both will be preserved. Jesus went even further and said they would say the old is better. It's the last verse in verse 39. And that is exactly what the Pharisees did. They saw this because they are used to and have mastered their legalism, so they're the elitist of their system and the top dogs, and look at me for score marks. Well, I'm sorry. I do not believe that we're here to take God points and God scores. The only score ever set for me is in heaven, and I will face my righteous judge when I get there about that. So they loathed this new covenant with Jesus, this new wine, if you would. Man always tends towards legalism and self-achievement. The Pharisees perfected this holier-than-thou attitude, this critical spirit. You cannot just add Jesus to what you're already doing, though, folks. He has to be the all-encompassing everything of everything. He is not a patch job to your problems or to your life. Then you go about your life and do what you want like you did before. It's going to fail. It's going to tear right off. He doesn't just season your life and he doesn't just add a little bit of new in there as you know it now and keep doing what you need to do. You don't simply add Jesus to your life. He transforms your life. He changes it like he did for Matthew and his outcast friends. Matthew was accepted and changed, so he invited Jesus over out of a heart of gratitude. He invited his friends because he wanted them to experience the same change. What about you? Have you been changed? Or are you still trying to do your life the way it has always been and add Jesus in where you can or where you feel you fell short? It won't work. It'll burst the bag. It'll tear the cloth even more. Why do you think so many Christians are acting disillusioned? Because they've been sold a bill of goods. Legalism. Bait and switch. Instead of just flat truth. Jesus can change you. But he has no interest in being just a tack on to your life. Do you know others who need this life change? That's what Matthew first concerned himself with, is inviting all the other outcasts and all the other ones that society had rejected, specifically religion had, and then giving them this life-changing Jesus. Do you know somebody in need of change? Are you in need of change? I invite you to email me, text me, call me, Facebook message me, find a way to connect. I can tell you how to have this life change. Say, well, I've been saved and something's not working. We're here to help you. It ought to be like we're reading right here. And many are experiencing this. But often the reason why we don't experience this real change, lasting change, isn't all the details that you should be doing in the Christian life. It's the fact, when you really boil it down, Jesus was a patch. He was a pour-in. He didn't completely consume and change. Do you need Jesus just to get you to heaven, or do you need Jesus to be your Lord and Savior? Do you need him to just help you out in your emotional crises and make you feel better about certain things and attached to him once, twice a week? Or is he your sovereign? In charge of everything. And you're fully surrendered. There's the difference in Matthew and these publicans. And then finally, the publicans and Matthew the same, in with Christ. And these outcasts, they're no longer outcasts. The real outcasts were the religious group who just flat out would not connect with Christ. All they had was a bucket of criticism. Just a bunch of water to pour on the fire of this new faith. If you need that, we're here to help. I love you guys.